Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast, episode 80. My name is David. I'm really glad that you joined us. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello, David.
Welcome to episode 80.
80.
We've done a lot of these.
Amazing. Yeah. It's amazing that we have that much to say.
Well, one of us has that much to say. It's amazing that people continue to listen.
Yeah.
No, we're so appreciative of all of you joining us on the Grow Podcast. I know all of you are so appreciative of Pastor Mike and his teaching on the Grow Podcast. So looking forward to another great year. That we're at 80, which means it's been like a year and a half of this.
It has.
It really doesn't seem like we've been doing it for that long. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I went back and looked, and it's like, wow, I forgot about that one. So if you're new to it, you may want to go back there. Hopefully we've gotten better.
It's actually the only time that Pastor Mike and I speak to each other anymore.
Yeah, so, we ignore each other.
It's once a week we get to talk. It's pretty. That's why we have such a dynamic.
Yes, because we ignore each other the rest of the time.
When we first started doing the lobby, if you don't know what the lobby is at our online campus. We just kind of hang out for the.
I watch it every week, and I still don't know what it is. But
I host it, and I don't know what it is. You named it though.
I did.
Episode 1.
I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
But we've stopped counting. We have no idea how many episodes of the lobby we've done. But during COVID, we started it where we were online only, and you had hired me as the first impressions coordinator, and there was nothing to coordinate because there were no first impressions.
So probably March or April 2020. We've been doing it steady since.
Yeah, and so we were like, well. The one thing that you're missing online is, you get to come to church and see your friends in the lobby. You just talk about whatever you don't, you don't have to dive deep into like, oh, last week's message. Sometimes you might have those conversations after, but usually beforehand, it's talking about what you did and what your kids are doing and everything. So anyway, that's the lobby. And I don't even remember how I started talking about the lobby. It was something to do with
stuff we talk about.
Oh yeah, that's right. Thank you, producer. When we first started doing that, and we would sit down, and it was me hosting, and then a different person pretty much every week back then, because it was kind of the whole staff, because we were all online, and I wouldn't have conversations with them beforehand because I didn't want I don't want to have a great fun or funny or interesting conversation with you and then the camera turns on and we have nothing to talk about for 15 minutes. And so
that's very strategic of you.
I was very strict about it. Like they would come sit down and the producers were getting everything ready. I was like, we are not talking right now. Like that sounds like a great story. You save it till the camera turns on.
I just learned something. Wow.
I no longer do that. That's not. I feel like we're in enough of a rhythm now. But
yeah.
I like the idea of you and I not speaking.
Not talking.
If we had lore, Grow
kind of
podcast
hurt by
lore.
that, but
I don't mean I want that to be the thing. It's a funny idea. I guess I did word that very poorly. I really like the idea of not having to talk to you, Pastor. That was sort of the idea.
HR and I are going to have a talk here.
HNR.
HNR. Yeah. You're just digging a hole here.
Who are HNR, Pastor?
It's tax season. They must be a tax group.
Yeah. That was sort of how the Grow Podcast got started, though. Yeah. The idea for the format of it, I should say, was just, I love just sitting down with you over, not coffee because neither of us drink coffee, but a drink from a coffee shop or lunch or whatever, and just talking about faith, talking about the Bible. And so I was like, well, let's let everybody else do the same thing. Just I'm the only one that gets to talk back to you during it. But so that, maybe we should try it. We're not going to speak until the next podcast, which we may or may not be recording after this podcast, but they don't need to know that. We'll cut that part out.
We'll see.
But we kicked off our new mini-series.
New mini-series that's part of our bigger series.
Jumped back into our big series, 31 weeks through the Bible. That was week 13.
Yes.
Which I didn't struggle with in our online recordings. I definitely did not say the wrong number 3 different times. Week 13. So we have a lot to go still.
Yeah. We're going to, in this 5 weeks, we're going to cover really the whole rest of the history in the Old Testament. So from king number 3 of Israel all the way through to the end of the exile. And we'll cover the history of that as we move forward. Then we'll come back for another 4 weeks and focus on 4 books that are kind of in the middle of that period. But really, in 9 weeks, we're going to cover all of the rest of the Old Testament. And
Yeah.
then we get to the New Testament, which, again, we're going to cover fairly quickly.
Yeah.
But we're going to land on Easter right at the resurrection. So it's almost as if we timed that, right?
Super weird how that
And we'll
happened.
come back and talk about the church.
What a coincidence.
So, yeah, isn't that amazing?
Now, our new mini-series is called 23andMe.
Yes, which is bothering everybody.
Hattie is very upset about
Yes.
it. And I don't know if she's let on
She loves
to
the title,
you.
but
She does.
She doesn't like the fact that I've not made it about DNA.
She's genuinely devastated. Like, it comes up almost every day. Not when you're there, so maybe
Yeah.
she's hiding it from you.
No, she's made it known.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds more like Hattie. Genuinely devastated. It's
Yeah.
not, I feel like, on like week 4, you should just take a DNA test and,
Yeah.
send it into Ancestry or 23andMe
Just
or
make it
one
part
of
of
these.
it.
Just
Yeah.
to, or make her do it.
There
and
we
be
go.
like,
For the lobby. Maybe
we'll
that's one of the
open-
lobby things.
We'll
Who are you
open-
related to?
Yeah, the lobby of the last week of 23andMe will break down Hattie's ancestry.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to do that. Instead, we're going to talk about some wisdom literature
On this
today.
first week,
Today,
yes.
that's what I mean. Today, we're going to do that.
Because we began talking about the wise king.
We talked
who
about Solomon.
Wasn't very wise.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's always one of the weirdest. It's a conundrum, which is a word that I love because it just sounds fun, but it also
Sounds very
fits here.
conundrum-ish.
Thank you. He's supposed to be have more wisdom, and he's so dumb. He has so many dumb things.
This is one of the interesting things. I think the brilliance of God, and again, and I've said this, and I'm going to say this multiple times, even in this series, and why the Bible is so convincing to me is, kind of moral mythology outside of the Bible. Moral mythology is we're going to tell you a story and give you kind of the moral anecdote at the end. But especially in this part of history, we find this, and we find that we find these moments, and even Solomon's life. It starts this way, where it says he made this real stupid decision, and then God to marry Pharaoh's daughter, which he was told never to do, and then God says, "Hey, let me write you a blank check. What do you want?" And gives him this amazing thing. And then the next thing is, and by the way, he's also worshiping pagan idols.
Right.
And you see this kind of clash of things, and sometimes the Bible comments on it. More often than not, what the Bible does is say he made this choice and this choice. This choice resulted in this. This choice resulted in this, and just lets you draw the conclusion, almost as if God's saying, "You've got free will here," which we do, And so I want you to learn to trust me in the middle of this.
The 3 books you touched on are
we covered 3 huge books of the Bible on Sunday.
And they're known as like the wisdom literature, which is kind of insulting to the rest of the Bible, as if there's no wisdom to be found other than in these 3 books.
Well, and it's a repeating thing we're going to talk about. So one of my goals in this 5 weeks is also to help us learn how to read some of the hard parts of the Bible to read. And because we're covering so much stuff, I think in week 3 of this series, we're going to talk about how to read and understand this part of the Bible more than anything else, and why it's so hard. But we tend to forget that there's different kinds of literatures in the Bible. There's history books, there's poetic books, there's apocalyptic books, there's biographical books. It's not like we just pick up a book and it's one style of literature. And the wisdom books are very unique to us. In the ancient world, this style of literature was very common.
Sure.
Was very, very common.
Let's just talk about the Bible in general real quick. Let us talk about, boy, my New Year's resolution is to enunciate, apparently. Let's talk about who organized the Bible. Where did that all come from?
The Old Testament was basically put together. Go ahead.
Well, because if I was going, first of all, we're using the book The Story as we go through this, which puts it in a different order than the order that we have it in. And secondly, like you just talked about, there's all these different styles of literature in there, which aren't as obvious to us for multiple reasons. One, they've been translated, obviously, so they're not in their native language. 2, most of us aren't like studies of literature, and so if I just open it and it's all in one book, there's a front and a back to the Bible, and everything's in the middle. There's nothing specifically saying this is a historical book. This is a, poetic book. This is
you kind of have to
read
and
into so who organized it the way that it currently is?
So of course, there's two parts of the Bible, right? There's the Old Testament, the New Testament, and we've talked a little bit about why they're that way. It's the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. We've worked through that this fall. So the Old Testament was really put together by what I'm going to refer to as kind of the ancient Jewish people, and there's three big parts to it that they'll still refer to today. Mm-hmm. There's the oldest part of it, which is the Torah, which means the teachings, and it's made primarily of the first 5 books where we spent Threads, our first part of our series, first 5 books of the Bible. Then I'm going to slaughter the Hebrew in this.
I'm excited for this.
My Hebrew teacher will cringe at this. But
I'm going to send these to my Hebrew professor and have him judge you.
Second part, the Hebrew word, I believe it's pronounced keveim, and that's the book of the prophets. Now, it's not entirely prophets. What?
That's just not how it's pronounced.
Oh, how's it pronounced?
I'm not going to try, but I don't think that's it. I've heard that word before, and it didn't sound like that. All right. You might be right. Maybe I heard it wrong.
Maybe I'm messing it up. And that's the histories and some of the prophets.
Yep.
And then you have the Ketuvim, which is the writings, and a lot of that is the wisdom literature. Not all of the wisdom literature, but a lot of the wisdom literature, in particular Psalms, Proverbs, and some of the narratives, especially the exilic, what they call the exilic ones, the ones during the exile to Babylon with the southern kingdom, which if you don't know what I'm talking about there, stick with us in the series because we're going to get to it. That's the Old Testament. The New Testament, which is a collection of the biographies of Jesus, the Gospels, or we talked about in the Christmas series, the Evangelions, the good news, and then we have the letters in the New Testament, and they were collected and brought together. And there's some early church leaders that brought them together, but it was the Council of Nicaea, really, in about 325 A.D. that kind of said these are them, and then they're kind of reaffirmed by the Council of Constantinople in 381. Now, if you have grown up Catholic or familiar with the Catholic Church, they have some other books in them.
Yeah,
and the reason for that is, especially during the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church said, no, we are the right church. And so they kind of came back and said, see, we can control what's in the Bible and what's not. So they added some other books that were not part of the original kind of, we aren't sure how accurate they are.
Yeah.
So that's why they were left out by Nicaea and Constantinople.
Is Daniel and the Dragon one of those? Is that in the Catholic one or no? It's in somebody's apocryphal.
Yeah, I believe.
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
There's a dragon in it.
Yeah. And there's some others. and there's some good stuff in there.
For sure.
But I just would be very careful. I do believe, and I would die for this, that the Bible we have in the 66 books is what I would call the inspired, inerrant Word of God. In other words, every author was inspired using their language, their culture, their story, their time period, inspired by God, and in its original writing is without error. Now, because we tend to translate things, translation we have to dig into it on some things. But in the big parts of it, I don't believe there's the major themes that there's errors in this.
I don't want to derail us too much, but what would you say to somebody who maybe they grew up Catholic, or maybe they're just like, maybe they're newer to their faith and they're like, well, there's these other books, like there's the Book of Enoch, and there's these other books that aren't in here that I hear about that people read, and what would you say? To that
it's just like with this. So I believe there's books that are scripture, and there's other books that have truth in them.
Sure.
Like there's modern authors that we talk about all the time.
Yeah.
That I say they're worth reading.
Yeah.
I don't put them in the same category.
Sure.
As that. And I think there's ancient authors. During the Christmas season, one of the things I did this year is I read the Advent or the Christmas sermons from St. Augustine. And they're hilarious. He's so sarcastic and so fun, but solidly true. Now I wouldn't call him scripture,
right?
But he's really good teaching and great stuff.
So then, where do the wisdom literature that we're talking about fit in?
The wisdom literature kind of fits into two parts, in the prophets and the writings, two later parts, and some of the wisdom literature is in some of the oldest. and some is in the more exilic, during the exile. So when
Will you
people
use the
talk
Hebrew
about
words again?
yeah, no, I'm not gonna. The wisdom literature. Most people, when they talk about the wisdom literature, they're talking about 5 books. Now, and again, we'll talk about this in a few weeks.
Okay.
The books, especially in the Old Testament, aren't necessarily all put together in chronological order. They're put together in groupings either by teaching or by style and genre. So like when you're reading about a king in 2 Kings, you could actually go forward a couple hundred pages to Isaiah or Hosea or Haggai and read the same story. And it's like, so that's part of why we're spending so much time on this these next few weeks. So the wisdom literature, there's 5 books. Job, which is the oldest. We actually aren't real sure. That's an old book, an old story when that was written. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, or sometimes you hear it called the Song of Solomon.
What? I don't know the answer to this.
Yeah.
Why does it have different? Like, why is it sometimes Song of Solomon? Why is it sometimes Song of Songs?
In the Hebrew, it's actually a repeated word, song.
Okay.
But it's hard to translate in modern thing. In the ancient world, that was saying this is the best song.
Okay.
This is the best. It's the song of songs. Whatever.
Like the King of Kings.
Yeah, the King of Kings. Sure. Okay. King. What that is. But people would kind of get confused by that because then it starts. Introduces itself to us saying Solomon was influential in writing this. Whether he actually wrote it or not, we can talk about. So that's part of why it's there.
Why don't we start there?
You want to start there?
I'll give you the easiest one to go on first.
And a lot of people are familiar with it, but it is a confusing book.
It's a weird book.
And it's a little, and like we talked about on the weekend, Jewish children, in particular boys, were not allowed to read it. And even today, a lot of them aren't allowed to read it till at least 14, 15, 16, because it's pretty graphic when you dig into it. It's very sensual, very, whatever.
It certainly stands out from not just the rest of the Bible, but even from the rest of the wisdom literature. I mean, it's just completely different than anything else you're reading.
And actually, when I'm talking to people, especially people who are kind of outside the faith, asking questions, that's one of the books I like to refer them to. It's just saying, God put this in there, and they're like, what? And it opens up, all kinds of conversations. We don't know for sure whether it was written by Solomon or not, because there's some questions. It's certainly, I believe, it was not about him. Some people say it was, but he appears as an extra character in it. But it's talked about, it's written in the style of Solomon. Most likely it was written during his reign, and he influenced the writing of it. The main character in it is a woman, so most of it is told, kind of goes back and forth from almost 3-4 different viewpoints. The main character is a woman. Then you hear from the man. You hear from some others from time to time. And then there's this little glimpse of the king, who's King Solomon in this. And it's poetic. Yeah. So it's poetic literature. And even though we read it and have divided it into 8 chapters, it's meant to be read as one flowing story and this going back and forth. And the purpose of it, people have really debated the purpose of it. A lot of people have, part of it because they struggle with the graphic nature of it. It's like, we have to spiritualize this. So it's not about physical love. I'll hear people say, it's talking about the intimacy we have with God. I'm going, no, as I read this, it's about romantic. It's about physical love. Yeah. It's about the goodness of God, and he created sex, and sex within God's design and marriage is amazing. And I tend to, when looking at Scripture, I tend to lean towards the simplest explanation. It says what it is. It's a celebration of love the way it was designed to be. Doesn't mean there isn't some symbolism in this. God certainly uses that. But it's not meant to be dissected, taken apart. And what's interesting is it's a kind of poem that was very common in that time period in the ancient world. You find it in other places around the world. So Solomon was using, or whoever wrote it was using, a common kind of thing. It's kind of like today, different movies. There's these certain kinds of styles of movies. But the storyline is an engaged couple and the progression of their relationship. how they want to be together. And so you get this intense desire for one another, and then they get separated and they search for one another, and then they find one another, and it kind of escalates till it just starts to get racy, and then it's like scene shifts, and you can read this, and it's celebrating the joy of physical attraction. And it can be really confused, because when you read these as literal descriptions, like her hair is like a flock of goats, or whatever, it's like, whatever. These aren't...
I think her teeth are like sheep that were just sheared or something like that.
Something like that. What is it? So they're not primarily visual metaphors, but when you reflect on the meaning, like when I was in Israel, a lot of their goats are long-haired goats, and they're just gorgeous hair. And so we were driving... I don't remember what part of Israel we were in. I think it was north in Galilee. We looked up, and it was one of those moments where it's like God just gave me this moment. And this flock of goats was winding down this green mountainside in the early morning mist, and the sun was just breaking over it, and you're going, I see it. I mean, it was just amazingly beautiful. And so it's descriptions of meaning. And so you have this back and forth. So as you read this, read it that way. Read it as a celebration of love. Read it as a celebration of, this is the way life is supposed to work. But the conclusion of it is in chapter 8, verse 16 through 14. It uses these things like, love is as strong as death. Many waters cannot extinguish it. Wealth can't purchase it. Basically saying love, especially physical love, is amazingly beautiful and life-giving, or horrifically dangerous and life-taking if it's lived outside of God's boundaries. And so be aware of the power of this amazing thing God gave us. With the wisdom books, all of the wisdom books, you need to take them all together, because one all by itself is like, okay. But when you begin to put these all together, God pieced these together and go, okay, now I have a much bigger picture. So this gives us, again, a thread we've talked about. Limits, God's limits produce life. And when we practice physical love, sexual love, romantic love within God's limits, it produces life.
Let's go to Proverbs next.
That's a little bit more black and white.
Proverbs.
And it feels black and white.
It does. I don't know, growing up in the church, like Psalms and Proverbs were almost like their own...
Yeah.
It was like you had the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then you had Psalms and Proverbs. I even remember, like, I went to private school in elementary school, and people in chapel would be like, no matter what you're reading, like, you got to make sure you're also reading a Psalm every day and a Proverb every day on top of any other reading you're doing in your Bible. And I don't know, Psalms and Proverbs were just elevated for me in my mind growing up. Like they were above and beyond the rest of Scripture.
They're so reflective of the human experience. So Psalms is so much, it's prayers and songs that are so reflective of human emotion and that. And Proverbs is, describing the way life is supposed to work. And so I think it's easier for us to digest and identify with these than some of the other things. And it's true. I mean, when you read, if you use like a Through the Bible in your reading plan, one of my favorites is I'll read a little bit of Old Testament, a little bit of New Testament, and every day there's a Psalm and Proverb. My mom taught me at a very young age kind of this numbering system, and it's kind of wacky, but it works, where there's a psalm that's kind of attached to every day of the year, and it's kind of weird. And then, of course, of Proverbs, there's 31 chapters in Proverbs, and typically, there's never more than 31 days in a month. Sometimes, so, on the first day of the month, you read Proverbs chapter 1, and if you skip a day, then read whatever day corresponds with that.
What do you do in February?
So it's very easy. Yeah, you only read 28. But Proverbs...
Are we going 31 weeks through Proverbs after we go 31 weeks through the whole Bible? That would be fun.
Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job really, I think, are meant to be understood together.
Okay.
And I think you need them all together because they all tackle a similar set of questions, but in different methods.
See, I understand what you're saying from a practical standpoint, but just the way I grew up in my mind, I never would have connected Job.
I wouldn't either till I dug into it. Yeah. But they really are. So think about it though. They all tackle the question: what kind of world are we living in? What does it look like to live well in the world? Yeah. And how do we be good at life? And what do we do when life doesn't go the way we think it should? You know, they all tackle it, but in different ways.
Sure.
Narrative, Proverbs is very black and white.
You're right.
Not, what's the word I'm looking for? Not descriptive, very prescriptive, you know, but they're taken together. Proverbs is written kind of from the perspective of a teacher. Here's some some advice to make life work best. In fact, it uses this kind of metaphor of, it almost refers to Proverbs as, or wisdom as a woman who's teaching us that we want to come close to. And there's I'm already slaughtered Hebrew, so I might as well slaughter this Hebrew word together. But the word for wisdom that we get in English in Proverbs is chokmah. I've probably slaughtered that one. It means more than wisdom. And some of this is a little bit of an ancient world. It's a kind of thread or a system that God wove into the fabric of the universe. It's kind of the way things work. And you see parts of this that have been twisted in other false religions, like karma and the universe and things, but have been twisted. But the idea of this is an attribute of God that was woven into the fabric of the universe. And it's kind of the moral law of the universe. And you see this repeated. The fear of the Lord is what? Is the beginning of this. In other words, you need to understand this is a healthy respect. Not that I'm scared to death of the Lord, but this understanding where this came from. So as you read through this, the first 9 chapters is teaching us that anyone can grow in this.
Yeah.
Anyone can grow in wisdom. No one's beyond growing it. This is a skill. Is to learn, to have wisdom, which is to understand the best way to live life and to speak. Okay? First 9 chapters talk about it. Then chapters 10 through 31 is this collection of small sayings, proverbs, that give guidance to life. And I think there's some things to remember. So if we misunderstand Proverbs, it can be simplistic or cause cynicism. And I talked a little bit about this on the weekend, that sometimes we read Proverbs as a promise instead of principles. But also, if we read Proverbs, it can be seen as simplistic. It's saying, well, if you do this, then this happens. But it doesn't always happen that way. That's why we need Job and Ecclesiastes.
Sure.
Okay? Life doesn't always work this cleanly. The point of a proverb is saying, this is how life is supposed to work best. This is how life is supposed to work best.
One thing before we move on.
Yeah.
You know, when you're talking about the first 9 chapters and how to grow in wisdom, as if it's like it's a skill we can develop. But then I don't feel like we often think of wisdom that way. We might think of knowledge that way, right?
Yeah.
You can study and you'll know more about that thing, but wisdom, we think of it, even in the Bible, when we're thinking about Solomon, he's given wisdom. He didn't have to sit and work at wisdom.
Right.
He was given it to him. Sometimes that might be hard for us to wrap our minds around, how like I can work at wisdom. I can get better at being wise. Why do you think that's not natural for us? When like it's clearly there, like you can grow in this.
Because wisdom comes from experience, right?
Sure.
So, it's been a while since we've used the basketball coaching metaphor, right?
Perfect.
So
bring it on.
But, so you play enough games, you begin to learn almost instinctively how to react in certain situations. For you as a coach, you coach enough games, you see something that may be overwhelming your high school players, and you're going, okay, we can handle this if you do what I tell you to do.
Yeah.
And from their perspective, they're going, but I'm on the floor, I see it differently.
Yeah.
I'm the coach, I see this differently.
Yeah.
But why? It's that experience, it's that learn to be able to see life from a different perspective.
Yeah.
That's part of why I think it's so good to read like a chapter of it a day. And it's the repeated, Romans 12 talks about not being conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's learning to see life through the lens of God at work. Like we've been talking about in the stories, see life through the upper story lens.
Yeah.
And that's what Proverbs helps us do.
Do some people just naturally have more, I don't want to say naturally, but just have more wisdom? Like if we're all starting from our base level of wisdom, it seems like some people have more than others.
And again, so it's because we're all created uniquely, right? So some people are more intuitive. Some people are more sensory, kind of black and white. So that can affect that. Some of it is how you were raised, and some of it is life experience. Some of the things that it's sad, but it's true. more difficult life experience often leads to more wisdom. We've talked about that, how some of our best learning often comes through some of the most difficult times.
So Proverbs needs to be read along with Ecclesiastes.
I think so.
Let's jump into Ecclesiastes. One of the few books where it's not a word that makes sense to, just Steve down the road who didn't grow up in the church. And you're like, what do you think of Ecclesiastes? He's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Tell us about Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes, and there's a lot of, did Solomon write this? Did not Solomon not write this? It said it was the teacher, the son of David. We assume that means Solomon, but it could have been someone further on. But it's definitely written.
Doesn't seem like Absalom wrote it.
In the in the spirit of Solomon's wisdom.
Okay.
You
didn't touch on the author of Proverbs. I don't know if you wanted to at all.
Most of it,
you touched on the
we
author
know
of the other one.
it says specifically was written or influenced by Solomon. But it also tells you. So as you read through, it'll say these are from, because some of it was added to later. The key to Ecclesiastes, to understanding it, is found in chapter 1 and chapter 12. It bookends it.
Okay.
And it uses this Hebrew. We're doing a lot of Hebrew. It uses this Hebrew word.
Such an easy language.
Havel. Havel. You got to do that. I practice that one. That in the English often translates as meaningless or meaninglessness, but it actually means like vapor, smoke, something temporary, but something mysterious. So it's not just that it's meaningless. It's not just that it means it's hard to hold on to. If you try to hold on to it, it's going to slip through your fingers. And so it starts that way, and then it ends that way, saying, don't get caught up in things that are hard to hang on to. Grab what you can hang on to.
Sure.
And so the whole goal, when you go through chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, is he begins to target the ways that we try to construct meaning or purpose or satisfaction in life. And he lists it all, right?
Yeah.
It goes through it all. And he deconstructs them. And then he kind of weaves in this whole thing of time. You've got a limited amount of time, and death comes to us all. And it's so discouraging. He's like, what's happening here? Are you depressed? Do you need some anxiety meds? What do you need here?
What was an anxiety med in ancient Israel?
I don't know what it would have been.
Maybe having 800 wives or whatever.
Yeah, 700 wives. I don't remember what it was, but then he just pokes in there once in a while, and he comes to this conclusion. So it's like you do this, but then he says, but there's part of that has meaning. There's part of eating well that, man, it feels good. There's part of being in love that feels good. There's all these kinds of things. And he said, and he just puts it this way. He said, enjoy the satisfaction that you get, even though it's temporary, because that's a gift from God. And the whole point of this is realizing, yes, life is supposed to work a certain way, but it doesn't in this world. Don't let that eat at you, or don't pursue the things you can't hang on to. Mm-hmm. But realize that everything is a gift from the only one who will ultimately satisfy you. So it's helping you deal with the proverbs that say, you do this, this happens. Right. Well, most of the time. Mm-hmm. But what happens when it doesn't do that? Well, it's hard to hang on to, but there will still be a blessing that will come. And so look at this, and it's a little bit more simply of everything is a gift from God. Trust him. So remember him. Hang on to him instead of trying to hang on to these other things. Yeah. And you've got to work through some of this. And then you add Job to it, which is a discussion we don't have time to go into. It's another kind of layer.
And why is the book called Ecclesiastes?
That is a question I didn't dig into. That's a great question.
There we go.
I don't know the answer
next
to that
week.
One. Yeah, we'll have
or maybe
to
in a few weeks on the podcast.
Yeah.
Pastor Mike will tell you why
question.
It's called Ecclesiastes. I didn't know the answer to that question. That was just me hurling it out there into space.
I'm sure someone will know.
Give us a comment in the and you can't Google it.
Yeah,
that's cheating.
You have to know.
We could just pause the podcast right now and Google it real quick.
I could pull out one of my books on the shelf.
Yeah, you probably have a textbook right behind the camera there that has it in there. Yeah. But, well, thank you, Pastor Mike. I really enjoyed this one. I'm really excited for this series. This mini series, I should say. Not that I haven't been excited for the other ones, but I've been really looking forward to this one. We went into Messiah, which was great, but I kind of missed the greatest story ever told. So I'm really glad that we're back. It was really fun to dive into Saul. Well, I don't know if fun's Saul. He's such an interesting character that
so much contradiction there with so many things.
I think that's the best way to put it. He's such a contradictory character.
It has been fun for me to write because we're getting some rich, detailed kind of history stuff, which for nerds like me, I love, but also intensely practical stuff of, I can put this, so the my story side of this really matters here. Yeah. And hopefully on the weekends I do my best not to, skip one or the other, but try and marry those together a little bit. That are helping us.
I mean, you can hang out at Lower Story on the history side of things as long as you want for me, but
for you, but not for everybody.
Well, and I probably need the other ones more is the ironic thing, just because the upper story or the lower story part's the part I'm gonna go read on my own anyway. So no, it's a really good series so far. I think everybody is gonna really enjoy it. Thank you, Pastor Mike, for the do you have any homework for us today? I almost forgot the homework. Well, we're a little longer this week. I was trying to wrap up quick.
I think homework, it goes right along with what we talked about the weekend. Just read along with us in the story. Yeah, and you can find the story still, even if you didn't buy one from the Williston campus or Tioga campus or online or whatever. We didn't write them. Yeah, you can find them online. I think most weeks online we still post the link when you're talking about it too, so people can go find it. Because I know a few people have bought it more recently, and you can just jump in where we're at if you want to keep along with us. So, let's make sure that we're reading. Thank you guys for being here. Growth always starts with the next step, as we always say at the Grow podcast. So this was a great next step to be here, but let's make sure we keep putting these things that we're learning into practice, not just listening to Pastor Mike share his wisdom. See what I did there? We're talking about wisdom literature. Not just listen to it and then ignore it, but it's almost like the Bible tells us to then do what it says. So let's make sure we do what it says as we're learning these things. Thank you, Pastor Mike, for being here. Thanks to all of you. Make sure you subscribe so you get notified when the new episodes go live every Monday at, I think, 6 a.m. They're still going live. And we will see you next time.